This is the last lecture of the politics unit. While some of the material discussed over the course of this lecture takes place chronologically in the 1990s, it is important to understand that the 80s mantra did not cease to be on December 31st, 1989. Since 1945, United States foreign policy had been shaped and based around the idea of a bipolar world. But when a multitude of factors converged in the mid to late 1980s, and as a result tore apart the once formidable Soviet Empire, the United States emerged as the only global hegemony. While Reagan's negotiations with Gorbachev towards arms control was important, it was primarily factors within the USSR and related to its allies that caused its collapse: a stagnant Soviet economy that was predicated upon faulty data, a backwoods technological state that was more reminiscent of the 19th and 20th century, and massive costs of maintaining socialist regimes in Warsaw Pact nations. But while the Soviet Union would not technically cease to be until New Year's Eve 1991, the process was set in motion following the opening of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989. While Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika brought much-needed transparency and restructuring to the stagnant Soviet state, the USSR, even by the end of the 1980s, wasn't quite ready to relinquish control of its eastern allies. However, when Berlin party boss Günter Schabowski mistakenly read in an East German Politburo meeting that the wall would open for the first time since its construction in 1961, massive crowds began congregating at the scar on the Berlin landscape. East German military officers did not know how to react. They worried that armed confrontation could lead to riots and chaos. And in the age of the 24-hour news cycle, violence in Berlin, unlike previous repressive episodes in Hungary and Prague, would surely be caught on camera. As a result, for the first time since the close of the Second World War, Germany was headed towards reunification. The destruction of the Berlin Wall was a hugely significant and symbolic moment. The wall itself represented the lack of freedom of citizens behind the Iron Curtain. And shortly after its destruction, Soviet puppet leaders were toppled in Lithuania and Romania, while other nations like Poland and Czechoslovakia witnessed their first democratic elections in over 50 years. With the crumbling of the Warsaw Pact, the structure of the Soviet Union also began to change. Instead of a vast empire with a multitude of nationalities and ethnicities living under one roof, nationalist movements in the West as well as in Central Asia led to the creation of new nations like Ukraine, Belarus, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, just to name a few. But despite sharing a suppressive past, these newly or re-established nations did not sever ties just yet. Instead of being part of a Soviet Union, a new entity emerged, a Commonwealth of Independent States, which was a loose confederation of independent nations. In a stunning display, the nations of the CIS actually competed together as a unified team at the 1992 Barcelona Olympics. While each nation surely wanted recognition as a viable independent state, the decision to compete collectively showed a lack of malice that had many looking at the future with a renewed sense of optimism. Ironically, the man who initiated or enabled many of the changes that eventually led to the dissolution of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev, found himself without a job in late 1991. With the Soviet Union no longer a political entity, his role as General Secretary had reached the end of term. But the establishment of the CIS was not as simple as randomly drawing lines on a map and distributing land indiscriminately. Even after major nuclear de-escalation, the USSR still possessed a massive arsenal of thousands of nuclear weapons. It was imperative that the USSR in its final moments took great care to ensure that additional nuclear states were not established. As a result, the Russian Federation became by far the largest of the newly established national republics, headed by new president Boris Yeltsin. Please stop and answer the following questions before continuing with this lecture. A few weeks ago, we discussed how a prominent piece of Reaganomics involved a massive increase in military spending in a somewhat counterintuitive attempt to bring the Cold War to an end. But in the context of the Cold War, while some of the spending did seem a bit excessive, like the Strategic Defense Initiative, Americans accepted the massive military expenditures because the Cold War and defeating the Soviet Union were seen as worthy causes. But following the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the emergence of a world where the United States was the only true global superpower, American foreign policy was in need of a massive reevaluation. But one thing was for certain: a return to Wilsonian isolationism was not in the cards. Following a decade-long war against Iran for most of the 1980s, Iraq, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, invaded the small emirate of Kuwait. If history has taught us anything, it's that the longer the war, the larger the debt. And despite American financial assistance in his campaign against Iran, as you can see on the bottom right of the screen, Donald Rumsfeld, a future Secretary of Defense for George W. Bush and longtime Defense Department liaison shaking hands with Hussein, Iraq still racked up major debts over the course of the 1980s. Considering its repressive political structure, selling bonds to the citizenry did not seem to be in the cards, so Iraq instead attempted to loot Kuwait of its valuable oil resources. Shortly following the turn of the 20th century, Teddy Roosevelt alluded to the United States as the policeman of the West. But following the end of the Cold War, the United States' global role had evolved even more. In a sense, perhaps desired, perhaps not, the United States had become the world's policeman. European nations acting alone neither desired nor could likely do anything to stop Saddam's advance into Kuwait. But the United States' war machine absolutely could. But instead of acting unilaterally, a mistake his son would later make in the aftermath of 9/11, President George H.W. Bush would act prudently, securing an alliance with various UN member nations and establishing a consensus force. While the United States shouldered most of the military burden, the fact that it had acquired foreign support was massive in the context of global perspective. The mission did not have the perception of American arrogance, but instead of a global peacekeeping mission. While Kuwait by itself was not a terribly consequential nation, it symbolized something more important. Had Saddam been allowed to occupy the nation without encountering resistance, that could have potentially led to subsequent invasions of other Arab states. And with Saudi Arabia bordering both nations, and possessing by far the largest oil reserves in the region, Iraqi occupation of that nation could have had the potential to seriously alter the global oil market. When Bush decided to commit American troops to deterring Saddam's advance, and a UN force soon followed, it took little time to halt the Iraqi imperialist effort. However, while Hussein was clearly a volatile figure, and his use of chemical weapons in the Iran-Iraq War had exposed him as a brutal dictator, Bush decided it would not have been prudent to remove the Iraqi leader from power. As unsavory a character as Hussein was, he provided stability to the Iraqi state. Without him, it was possible that a power vacuum would lead to massive domestic unrest. But while this may have been the right call in retrospect, Bush was widely derided for his decision. Even his own Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, who would later emerge as vice president under George W. Bush in 2001, and other neocon cabinet members were critical of the decision. But Bush's previous career as a diplomat and intelligence officer served him well, and while SNL had a field day with his frequent use of the word prudent, and his caution may have contributed to his defeat to Bill Clinton in 1992, along with his decision to raise taxes after promising not to, even though it was absolutely necessary thanks to the massive budget deficits that resulted from Reagan's economic policy, Bush's caution in foreign affairs is a mantra that the United States may benefit from utilizing more in the future. Please stop and answer the following questions before continuing with the lecture. It seems strange to think that two major American foreign policy successes in the late 1980s and early 90s created the foundation of the international struggles we currently face as a nation. While the Iranian hostage crisis was perhaps the first time many Americans saw a visual manifestation of Arab hatred for the United States, anti-Americanism in the Middle East had origins far before the late 1970s. The United States played a crucial role in the establishment of the Israeli nation in the aftermath of World War II, and our continued support during the Yom Kippur War of '73 led to a subsequent short-term oil embargo that brought with it the first serious of a few major 1970s oil shocks. But while the American-Israeli alliance was detested by the larger Arab community, it wasn't until the aftermath of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan when anti-Americanism began to reach a boiling point. Throughout the 1980s, the United States had funneled financial aid and military armaments to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. A budget that began at a paltry $5 million eventually ballooned into the hundreds of millions. However, American military aid was only earmarked as long as the conflict persisted. In previous weeks, I have discussed Afghanistan's lack of national infrastructure, and while the nation was quite backwoods even before the Soviet invasion, in the aftermath it was even more scattered. But because of the covert nature of the American aid to the Holy Warriors, the federal government would never come out and publicly discuss American support for the Mujahideen. The feasibility of providing reconstructive aid to Afghanistan following the retreat of the Red Army was simply not plausible. As a result, instead of the potential of a relatively stable and organized Afghanistan, the country deteriorated into tribal warfare, with various ethnic factions competing for power. While the Mujahideen would never materialize into a viable political party, the power vacuum that existed in Afghanistan allowed for the rise of an Islamic fundamentalist political entity known as the Taliban to rise to influence. The same Taliban that provided refuge to al-Qaeda, the terrorist network responsible for the attacks on September 11, 2001. But American aid and then lack thereof in Afghanistan was only part of the equation. Following the halting of Saddam's advance into Kuwait in the early 1990s, to protect against future Iraqi imperialism, the United States stationed troops in Saudi Arabia. While practical in a vacuum, a failure to account for regional ideology proved to be costly and tragic. In the Muslim faith, the city of Mecca is of particular importance. One of the 5 pillars of Islam, the Hajj, is a pilgrimage to Mecca which all Muslims must take over the course of their lifetime. With this Islamic fundamentalism on the rise, particularly in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution, as well as the subsequent establishments of Islamic states in Afghanistan and Pakistan, an American military presence in the nation where the most holy Muslim city is situated was deemed by individuals such as Osama bin Laden, the former Mujahideen-turned-terrorist, unacceptable. Bin Laden later referred to the United States as infidels in the Holy Land. While the American military presence in Saudi Arabia was purely for deterrence purposes, it still infuriated Islamic fundamentalists. Soon thereafter, a number of terror attacks targeted American symbols. In 1993, 8 years before the attacks on 9/11, Ramzi Youssef, a Kuwaiti national, detonated a bomb in an underground parking garage which he hoped would bring down the World Trade Center. 6 people were killed, but the lack of large-scale destruction allowed the incident to skirt under the radar for many Americans. In the late 1990s, Osama bin Laden orchestrated the bombings of 2 American embassies in Western Africa, in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Those attacks killed over 200 and injured an additional 4,000 plus. In late 2000, the USS Cole was attacked by a suicide bomber while docked in a Yemen port. While none of these terror attacks were nearly as devastating from a cumulative loss of life perspective as the attacks on 9/11, they were also not random acts of violence. For many Americans, dismissing these attacks as random was a defense mechanism. For the alternative of coming to the conclusion that these attacks were a calculated reaction to American policy was far more disconcerting. While the end of the Cold War was undoubtedly a relief to many, the pivot to a new type of ideological conflict was in a sense far more challenging. From the mid-40s through the late 80s, the United States was able to at least identify tangible adversaries. But in this new age of ideological warfare, not only was identification of an enemy more challenging, but the necessity of changing an adversarial ideology to make a substantive difference presented a whole new set of challenges. Please stop and answer the following questions. Thanks for listening. This lecture was the last of the politics unit. Next week, we will focus more comprehensively on the economic policy of the 1980s. See you then.